Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. We're doing something different today. Some time ago, I was blessed to sit down with my friend Dr. Matthew Bunson in person on the Good News Cruise to talk about church news and current events. We got to talk about the time Matthew met Archbishop Fulton Sheen in person. I want to go straight to that conversation now.
I want to start with the happy news. A hero of mine who, you know well, in Malaysia I didn't have Catholic resources,
Right.
but this man's work I was able to download for free because it was Creative Commons.
Yep.
Archbishop Fulton Sheen.
Yes,
The beatification is finally moving forward.
it is. This was joyous news. We had the word from the Diocese of Peoria, Bishop Tilke, that he had received the green light to proceed with the beatification. Now, he's the one who made the announcement because the cause in this case started in Peoria, where Fulton J. Sheen was born. And so he's the one who received, interestingly enough, not an email, not a Zoom call, not a Teams message, not even FaceTime from the Holy Father. It was a letter that arrived in a diplomatic pouch to the Apostolic Nunciature in Washington, D.C., and then was relayed to Bishop Tilke, because this is a very formal process. Mm-hmm. And the only problem we have, amidst all of this joyous news, is that we don't actually have a formal date yet set for the beatification. The assumption is that it will be this year. The other assumption is probably September, something like that, because an event like this, especially in the U.S., is going to take a lot of time to prepare, and there's going to be, I could see everyone in this room, you, me, we're all very interested in this. So then the next question is where it will happen. The assumption has been for a while it would be Peoria, but it could be other places like the nearest large city. In this case, it would be St. Louis. So you can be very fortunate if you live in St. Louis.
And for the rest of us, we're going to fight tooth and nail to be there.
Yes, we will.
Now, there are a lot of issues that have hit us because of just the nature of Fulton Sheen's work, but also the time in which he was doing the work.
Right.
We've talked about this in the past, but before we go into the weeds of those, one of the issues we've spoken about too is Peoria wants to claim him.
Yes.
New York wants to claim him.
Yes.
And there's a long history of ministry where typically canonized individuals are remembered for where they did the ministry, right? So
Right.
Peter of Rome, James of Jerusalem, Anthony of Padua.
That's right.
Now, just given that history, tell us about the issue here.
Now, the counter argument would be somebody like Francis Xavier.
Oh, of course. Yeah, we don't call him Francis of Japan or Malaysia, that's right.
We should, but he's buried, of course, in Goa. So
Oh, Goa, that's right. Yeah, Francis of Goa. That
Francis
would be cool.
of Goa. In this case, Fulton J. Sheen spent so many years as an auxiliary bishop in New York. And if we have some time, I'd love to just go back a little bit about his life, because he is so remarkable a figure, both in terms of his intellect and also his holiness. But he served as an auxiliary bishop in New York and did remarkable work there as the head of the Pontifical Mission Society. And then was appointed in the 60s to the Diocese of Rochester. By that point, however, he was a mainstay, and had been for decades, in television and radio. I'm going to guess that almost everyone joining us here today has seen or heard Fulton J. Sheen in their lifetime, either on radio or in television. I had the great privilege of knowing him as a kid. So proving that I am a relic, I guess I'd be classified as either the third or can you be a fourth class relic that you shook?
Because you shook his hand. Well, maybe just your hand, you know?
Just my hand, yes. In this case, though, he came to Hawaii when I was a kid. And he stopped a couple of times and actually had dinner in my house. I served Fulton J. Sheen dinner as a little kid.
You're just rubbing this in at this point.
He had magnificent table manners, that's all I can say. But even as a kid, and he was elderly by that point, because this is around 1974, so he died about 5 years later, he was still, the word I've always used about him is a colossus. He's a colossus in Catholic media, he was a colossus in the intellectual world. But to your question too, here was someone who, in his time, was a global figure too in Catholicism. So as an auxiliary, as Bishop of Rochester, and then he retired and spent those last years traveling the world, speaking, reaching out, raising money still for the pontifical missions. This was one of the greatest communicators in the history of the church, and one of the greatest, certainly one of the greatest Catholic communicators of the 20th century. You could make the argument, along with Mother Angelica, but I think Fulton J. Sheen, I think she would say that Fulton J. Sheen was the greatest Catholic communicator of the 20th century. We always have to salute as well and add into that mix Pope St. John Paul II, whose extraordinary travels changed the world. But in his own way, so did Fulton J. Sheen.
Boy. And, okay, so just to sort of end on a slightly humorous note, but also to talk about his just physical visage on camera, the man knew how to work the camera well.
Yes.
So here's this anti-Catholic, new Pentecostal man, and in Malaysia no less, and I have no Catholic resources to really study the faith. A bunch of Googling led me to this man named Archbishop Fulton Sheen. I pull up one of these videos and I'm wondering, why is this guy walking around, writing on a chalkboard, dressed like Batman?
That's right. Well, I've seen comparisons to why is he dressed like Dracula? Because he had the
worse. That's right.
Exactly. You're right. And this is the thing that was so remarkable when he began his television show. He'd been on radio for years and years and years, and had one of the highest audiences in the United States for radio. And then somehow came up with the idea, and someone asked him if he'd be interested in doing television. So he went on NBC. And not only was he successful, he had millions of viewers every week. And you said something really important. His show consisted of, it had almost no graphics. Other than the slate.
Yeah, no props.
Right. Fulton J. Sheen. And he would come out dressed, as you said, this magnificent cassock and all of that, fariolo and all of that. And he would just stand there looking at the camera. And he had the most dramatic way of speaking directly to camera. And then, at a certain point, he would walk up, and you're right, all he had, the only prop he had was a chalkboard. And he would write. And the thing about it was that he had a massive Catholic audience, but he also had a massive Protestant audience. My late mom told the story that when she was a kid, she went into some homes of some Lutherans and began talking to their daughter, and they all went, shh, shh, Fulton J. Sheen is on. So she had no idea who that was, but then quickly learned about it, and that, I think, is one of those little things that also led to her conversion to Catholicism from the Episcopalians. But it was must-see television. And he beat out the likes of legendary television figures like Milton Berle, who complained about it, but affectionately. And of course, Sheen won the Emmy Award. And very famously, when he got up to accept it, he said, "I want to thank my writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John."
Oh, my favorite
But
joke
he
from
had
him.
no script. He never used a script. He was simply given the topic, or he would choose the topic, and then he would just unfold everything that he knew on this particular subject. And the subject seemed endless. In an era of, now when we look back, sort of baseline morality, there was a certain common language that we could have. So he had these great literary references. He could convoke and invoke Shakespeare. He could quote the great poets, Dante and others. But he was also able to speak to the hearts of people all over the United States and all over the world in a language that they could understand. And I've often wondered, if he were around today, what the reaction would be to him and how he would respond to the efforts, inevitably, to cancel him, how he would address that. And I think the more we can think in those terms, the more we can also lean on his wisdom and his teachings, always faithful, always orthodox, in responding to the great cultural crises of our time. Because he was brilliant in anticipating the problems that we have today.
We're going to pause my conversation with Dr. Matthew Bunson there and go on to our break, but we're continuing on the other side. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. As I mentioned in the first segment, I was blessed to have sat down with my dear friend Dr. Matthew Bunson. The funny thing is, for as close as we are as friends and as much as we collaborate, we don't actually get to meet up with each other in person a lot. And so the rare occasion where we do get to do that for work events, we are blessed to be able to share in camaraderie and brotherhood, and the fact that we are brothers in arms in this mission of evangelization for the salvation of souls. This was one such occasion we were blessed to have connected on the Good News Cruise. Matthew and I are talking about Archbishop Fulton Sheen, but this is not just the surface level. He was a good theological teacher. We're going to address that, sure. Archbishop Fulton Sheen was also a man who had his finger on the pulse of history and society because the faith taught him to do that. And Matthew is going to help draw that out. And then after that, we will speak about Jimmy Lai and the situation that's happening in Hong Kong. Let's go on to that conversation.
We remember him for his catechetical work, masterful catechetical work, and like you mentioned, capacity of commentating well on camera and radio. But the man was not only a masterful catechist, he was also a philosopher, theologian, and culture commentator. And in a lot of ways, he pioneered the kind of Catholic, even Christian cultural commentary that you and I do today.
That's right. So for those who may not be familiar with his background, he studied for the priesthood, and he studied also at the University of Leuven in Belgium. And he was such a phenomenal student in working for his dissertation, his dissertation in his doctorate for philosophy, that he was awarded what's called the Désiré Cardinal Mercier Award for the grandeur of his thought. Then he went to Rome and studied for a doctorate in sacred theology from the Angelicum, the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas. So this is somebody who had two different doctorates, the highest doctorates that you could receive, one in philosophy, one in theology. He found that an absolutely essential grounding, but it was also his understanding is, you said something really important, Marcus, and that is to understand culture, where we are, where he was at that moment in culture. And I say that too because as a commentator, he was able to be positioned perfectly to see the isms of the 20th century. He was very much concerned, for example, about secularism, materialism, communism, and socialism.
Yeah.
All of those we're grappling with today. I've said it on your show many times, that when it comes, for example, to the popes, if the world had listened to the popes over the centuries, the world would be a much happier, more stable, prosperous, and spiritually grounded place. In the same way, I think, had more people listened to the wisdom of Fulton J. Sheen about those isms, we would be in a much happier spot too.
I agree. His commentary on communism, I think we've all but forgotten it, but and every prediction he put forth turned out to be true, and that actually presents a great segue. He warned us about the dangers of totalitarian government.
Yes.
He warned us what happens if we don't take all of these Christian heritages across history well, if we take it for granted. And Hong Kong is showing us where we might go if we don't preserve our heritage right now.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So we have in the People's Republic of China, we have some coverage in the National Catholic Register. The title of the piece is Jimmy Lai's Sentence of 20 Years. It's a stark symbol of authoritarian overreach. And it's an apt title, but in some ways it even downplays what is happening in Hong Kong, because Hong Kong is the next step for the People's Republic. We have seen what they've done in China. We have seen not just the Chinese Catholic Patriotic Church, which is the state-controlled church. We have seen the effort on the part of the government of Premier Xi Jinping to embark on what they call Sinicization, which is the transformation of all of the religions that exist in China into a model that mirrors the Chinese Communist Party and what they see, at least, is Chinese culture. Now, let's be realistic, that 1949, that's how long communism has been in charge of China. So to claim that somehow communism is the culture of China is to dismiss several thousand years and some of the great dynasties in the history of China. So that effort at control is something new in the history of China. And when they took over Hong Kong in the late 90s, It had what was an SAR, a special administrative region. It was supposed to be guaranteed to have certain fundamental rights to be protected, certainly in keeping with the agreement with England, the Great Britain for the takeover. Slowly, the Chinese government has eroded all of that to the point now, as we see with Jimmy Lai, one of the great defenders of democracy in the world, that anything is now possible. And I think the people in Hong Kong see that. And we talked about prophets in Fulton Sheen. One of the great prophets of this has been Cardinal Zen, the former Bishop of Hong Kong, who has lived through this. He himself has been arrested. He himself has been put on trial for what the Chinese call anti-democratic or anti-party activities.
Yeah, seditious activities.
Seditious activities, yeah. So this is a warning to everyone, but at the same time, we are seeing very similar totalitarian movements in vacating speech, limiting the rights of speech. I can think, for example, of the case right now in Brazil, where a young woman was arrested and now faces potentially 10 years in prison for commenting in social media that a man is a man and a woman is a woman. So Brazil has introduced some of the most draconian and radical of its transgender laws. And once the laws are on the books, as we see in Scotland, as we see in the United Kingdom, we can get back to them in a second, as we see in Canada, and in some parts now even in the United States, how a local jurisdiction, or increasingly the state itself, chooses to interpret some of these laws is going to bring potential arrests, prison sentences, and the silencing of those who do not adhere in an Orwellian fashion to the command of the language.
Some people might say you and I utilizing that term Orwellian is an overreach or an overuse, but this really, Orwell predicted this. The other thing, I think everyone here is wondering, in the 90s when control wasn't ceded, but at least allowed to the CCP.
Yeah.
Are any of us surprised that this is happening now?
No, I think Fulton Sheen would have been the one to say that the minute you put socialists, communists in charge of a government, this inevitably follows. We go back to, you and I have talked many times about Rerum Novarum.
Yes.
Pope Leo XIII's great, the Magna Carta of Catholic social teaching, in which he warned about socialism in particular, because it is not based in the recognition of the dignity of the human person, but in the overwhelming rights and authority of the state. And it always comes back to one of those fundamental questions: where do our rights come from as human beings? Do they come from the natural order created, that we are made in the image and likeness of God, and therefore our rights are inviolable, that they are basic to us? Or do those rights actually stem from given to us by the state? And if something is given, it can be taken away. We know that in great Christian Catholic teaching, Catholic anthropology, that God will never take away that dignity. We may choose to sin, but God won't take back what he's given to us freely out of love as a gift. The state certainly will.
Sorry, I shouldn't laugh at that. You're right. And so that's the state pretending to be God.
Yes, and that was one of the warnings that Leo XIII gave. And he circled one thing that is really interesting to me, and it's because now it's such in the discussion of politically, socially, property. Do we have a right to own property? And if we do own property, is it ours to dispose of? Is it ours to do what we want with it?
I wish that what you were talking about is a theoretical problem.
Right.
That was so far away. I mean, you remember a time in history when we used to talk about the red tide, and as if it were just halfway across the world.
Right.
And that no longer is the case.
And we're going to have to pause my conversation with Dr. Matthew Bunson there because we're running out of time in this segment. But Matthew and I are talking about this reality of communism and socialism and how it is an abhorrent ideology in contrast with the revelation of Christian faith. Archbishop Fulton Sheen saw that clearly. A mutual hero of ours, he diagnosed the problem and gave us a solution in Christ. Continuing on the other side, I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon, welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter, talking with my friend Dr. Matthew Bunson, whom I was blessed to have met up with in person, and we had an extended conversation. We're talking about Archbishop Fulton Sheen and the things that he taught us about the faith and also about communism. Let's go on to that conversation.
One thing we can go back to Fulton J. Sheen. He was always worried about the impact of universities. Look at 1968, for example. That was the great year of Humani Vitae by Pope St. Paul VI. But in 1968, too, we had this massive upheaval around the world. The French term was the 68, so the 68ers. And that was a reference to the massive social and political upheaval that we saw in France. There was also the revolution in the United States and Western Europe. The march through the institutions was one of the phrases that was used in that era.
It was by design.
By design, to advance an agenda for progressive ideas, specifically relating to human sexuality, to the questioning of authority, to the reconfiguration of the family, to economic and political restructuring. And they targeted specific institutions: politics, media, and law. But the other one that they really went for was education. The universities became these significant grounds to transform, basically, what they saw as excessively, unacceptably conservative, traditional faculties and ideas, and bring in these, what they've termed as fresh ideas, a new look on the world. And that, of course, entailed the takeover of faculties. And the areas they targeted especially were political science, communication, and media and the arts, and to some degree law. As anyone knows, that if you want to be able to control a country, there are certain things you need to do. One is to control how laws are interpreted. That a law that is on the books can be interpreted in a variety of different ways. We've seen that sort of worldview with the US Supreme Court. And then there is media and communications. And in terms of secular media, no one trusts them, in part because it's now been decades of clear media bias, a transformation of schools of journalism from teaching the fundamentals of the ethics of journalism to what is openly called advocacy journalism, in which, as a journalist, I feel, they say, obligated to do my reporting to accomplish certain things, to introduce equity, is one of the terms. To promote an agenda of reproductive rights. So the list is fairly long, and I think we all know it. But then there's also the more interesting part, even more disturbing than that, and here we go back to Orwell. The command of the high ground in culture requires you to have command of the language. And so obscure philosophers named Jacques Derrida and Foucault, who questioned what is communication, what is language, and seriously questioned through the process of deconstruction, what can we know, can we actually communicate? And to obfuscate, to transform, to enter confusion and doubt into an ability to communicate. It's why also we see the presence of Orwellian-like euphemisms. I will give you two, I just used one. Reproductive care is a euphemism for abortion. Gender-affirming care is another one, which is obviously, it sounds entirely benign. Who would possibly be against affirming someone's gender? So it goes back to the state, it goes back also to the use of language to obscure or to camouflage what the real intention is, but also the fundamental reality of what something like abortion is.
Every person sitting here either has children or grandchildren or knows someone who has children or grandchildren who has suffered from the rethinking of the institutional authority, where the nuclear family, where the rightful institutions of moral framework have been jettisoned.
That's right.
I want to invite you to speak to that, not just as the intellectual that you are, but also your pastoral heart, the concern that this is where we are, but there really is a pathway forward.
Yeah, there is. Well, first, we have to acknowledge the heartbreak within families. As you said, absolutely, Marcus, that we have so many families that are multi-generational, who perhaps had at one point 11 grandkids, have grown up, and maybe 1 or 2 are still in the Catholic Church. But then we also have, as is always the case, and I know there have been a lot of discussions, is there in fact this movement on the part of young people, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, toward the faith? Now, a lot of it, we're trying to do a lot of research at EWTN News to document, to really understand this phenomenon. It began in an anecdotal way, but I think we are beginning to see numerically that it is affirming. That Gen Zs, these 2 younger generations, are intrigued by faith. They're intrigued by belief. They're intrigued by the stability of the Catholic Church. Because in a world where nothing, I was just talking about Foucault and Derrida and the obliteration of the certainty of language. If nothing, well, what was it, Chesterton, I'm paraphrasing, he said, if you find me somebody who will believe in nothing, I can find you someone who will believe in anything. And they're seeing these realities in culture of people who will fall for anything and left empty. Whether it's the sexual revolution that promised fulfillment and happiness, whether it's radical feminism that promised happiness, whether it's this belief in these messianic figures who rise and fall. The church, as she always has, offers clarity, offers truth, offers also reality. There is biological reality, but it is also affirmed theologically. And I think young people see that. The willingness of a priest, for example, to go to jail, to prison, rather than reveal the contents of a confession. Okay, that strikes people as either this guy's crazy, who would do that if it doesn't matter? The reverence that we have seen and the Eucharistic miracles that we have seen about the Eucharist, the Eucharistic revival in the United States, was a real thing. It was a real phenomenon. And we're seeing the impact of that. But we're also seeing in places like Europe, in Belgium, in the Netherlands, in Scotland, in the United Kingdom, young people showing up in almost shocking numbers that we haven't seen in 50 or 60 years. They're showing up at the door of churches. They're asking priests. They're showing up in universities. The Newman Centers in secular universities are packed with young people. And what's really interesting is when they ask them, what are some of the names that brought you here? They say things like Thomas Aquinas, St. Thomas More, John Henry Newman. What is kind of interesting too is that the Gen Zs tend to be a little more sober, both mentally, in some ways spiritually, but also physically. The wine consumption, beer consumption, for example, is way down among Gen Zs. That's bad news for the wine industry.
Good news for us.
Right, yes, it is. Their livers thank them. But at the same time, I think it's a reaction to what they have seen with the millennials and the Gen Xers. The baby boom generation, which gave us, so I'm a product of that, life was pretty good. I mean, we had very few problems other than the risk of nuclear holocaust growing up from the Cold War. But there was also there was stability in culture, that the nuclear family still existed. So millennials then really began ushering in. In some ways, I can include myself as Gen X was responsible in a lot of ways for the problems that we have. That we're sort of in leadership now, and we're about to hand off to the millennials, and we'll have to see how that plays out.
Yeah.
But the Gen Zs tend to look at those previous generations, and they don't necessarily like what they have seen. That every young person in their heart is looking for a cause bigger than they are. And I think it's one of the reasons why certain leftist groups like Antifa and others do draw a lot of young people. The other thing to consider about Gen Zs is that they are somewhat suspicious. And so we'll have to see if they, understandably so, because of the cynicism that exists across culture toward almost every institution, that so many, the millennials felt betrayed in many ways by institutions. And the Gen Zs, I think, are worried about that same thing. Now, let's look at it historically. it was said that Aristotle was firmly convinced that the next generation was going to ruin the world. And the next generation, if I recall, was Alexander the Great. So mission accomplished. But
The generation after him, though.
Exactly. But what I'm saying is that, too, each generation tends to look at the generation that follows, that the world is doomed. And yet somehow we always manage to survive through providence, through the carrying on of the church, as the great Cardinal Francis George said, you know, I will die in my bed, and all of that, and my successor. But if we look at the 20th century, the greatest generation, the generation that preceded it, coming out of World War I, that generation, they were pretty sober too, because they survived the flapper years, the lost generation coming out of World War I. They survived the Great Depression. They were inherently frugal. I think all of you can remember your parents and your grandparents.
Yeah,
and
saving
what
the
they
bacon
saw.
grease, and yeah.
That's right. So things are very cyclical, and the important part is that we do everything we can as Catholics to support and build the church for what will be the next inevitable set of cultural crises. And while we're doing it, bring this joy and hope and trust that the Gen Zs are going to come through for us. There may be smaller numbers, but the power of that can transform entire cultures, as we have seen in the history of the church.
And we're going to have to cut that conversation I had with Matthew over here. Matthew is completely right. Let us pray and hope that the next generation appreciates the gifts of Western civilization and transforms the culture for Christ. Thank you for joining us. I'm Marcus Peter.